He smirked, the champagne glinting in the crystal glass, and whispered, "I'd rather kiss a dog than you." Her lips curved into a quiet, deadly smile. That night, everything he owned would crumble, and she would rise. The grand chandelier threw shards of light across the polished marble floor, each reflection dancing like a tiny star. Isabelle Dupont stood near the French windows of her penthouse suite, her fingers tracing the cold metal of the balcony railing. The city stretched below her like a living, breathing canvas of lights and movement. She inhaled deeply, savoring the quiet before the world demanded her attention. Despite the opulence surrounding her, the designer gown draped effortlessly on her frame, the faint scent of Chanel floating in the air, Isabelle felt a persistent ache, one no diamond could mask. She adjusted the pearl bracelet on her wrist, an heirloom she never allowed herself to wear in public. To anyone else, she was the picture of elegance, the epitome of a millionaire's wife, a life of luxury without struggle. But behind her calm facade was a simmering tension she refused to show, a longing that wealth alone could not satisfy: respect. Real respect. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you are hooked in and you are ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. Across town, in the heart of the financial district, Julien Moreau's office towered above the skyline, a gleaming monument to his empire. He lounged in his leather chair, legs crossed, a glass of vintage cognac in hand. The city's pulse reflected in the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. He was a man accustomed to control over money, business, appearances, and even people. His tailored suit clung perfectly to his broad frame, the cufflinks gleaming like tiny mirrors. He smirked at his reflection, a habitual self-assurance that bordered on arrogance. Julien thrived on the thrill of power. Contracts, mergers, and acquisitions were his playground, each victory a testament to his intellect and ruthlessness. Yet, for all his bravado, there was a gnawing restlessness he refused to acknowledge, a hollow echo in the spaces where love or genuine connection might have thrived. In the rare moments of quiet he felt it, a subtle void, but he quickly drowned it with work, with attention diverted to his material conquests. Back in her penthouse, Isabelle slipped her phone from her clutch, scrolling past congratulatory messages and business updates she no longer had patience to read. She paused at a photo Julien had sent earlier that week, a smug, playful grin, holding a champagne flute, surrounded by his colleagues. The caption read, "Success tastes better than a kiss." Isabelle's fingers tightened around the phone. It was subtle, yes, but every word, every smirk, every public display of dismissiveness, chipped at her quietly burning frustration. Tonight would be another gathering, another display of wealth and social acumen. Isabelle could feel the air thickening, like static before a storm. She wasn't just attending for appearances, she had begun noticing cracks in Julien's perfection, in his empire, in the carefully curated world that he so proudly displayed. And for the first time in years, she considered what it might feel like to be more than an accessory to his grandeur. Meanwhile, Julien adjusted his tie, casting a calculating glance at the sprawling city below. He was expecting Isabelle at a gala tonight, a celebration for the launch of his latest luxury hotel chain. To him, it was trivial, another event to showcase his brand and dominance. Isabelle's presence was almost incidental. And yet, somewhere deep inside, he harbored a faint expectation that she would laugh at his jokes, agree with his proclamations, and shine in his reflected spotlight. A test, he thought, to see if she could meet the standard he demanded of the world around him. The contrast between them was stark. Isabelle, with her quiet fire, simmering beneath an elegant exterior, craving acknowledgement. Julien, with his blinding arrogance, blind to the subtle truths that simmered just out of reach. Neither realized just how quickly the evening would tilt the axis of their lives. The gala arrived in a flurry of velvet gowns, polished shoes, and whispered introductions. Isabelle's entrance drew the usual polite attention, soft smiles, nods of recognition, but she navigated it with deliberate grace, aware that tonight's subtle observations mattered more than laughter or small talk. Julien arrived shortly after, commanding attention without effort. His smile was practiced, his charm calibrated to leave an impression of effortless superiority. And then it happened, a careless joke, delivered in a room full of glimmering wealth and eager ears. Julien, never one to temper his arrogance, leaned over to Isabelle, his voice dripping with condescension. "Honestly, I'd kiss a dog before I kissed you." The words were casual, but their weight slammed into her chest like a hammer. The room continued in polite murmurs, unaware of the seismic shift that had just occurred. Isabel's eyes narrowed, catching every syllable. The words weren't just cruel, they were a map. They revealed Julian's arrogance, his carelessness, his belief that she was incapable of action beyond decorative presence. And in that instant, she recognized the opportunity shimmering within the humiliation. Power, she realized, didn't belong solely to those with money, it belonged to those who dared to seize it. She moved closer, graceful and unassuming, as if the moment hadn't registered, and leaned in slightly, her voice soft but sharp. "Julian, you must be very proud of your charm." Her lips curved just enough to suggest a polite smile, masking the fire behind her gaze. Julian raised an eyebrow, swirling his cognac, amusement flickering across his face. "And are you offended, Isabel? I assure you, I meant no harm." His tone was light, teasing, confident that she would laugh it off. But Isabel didn't laugh. She allowed the moment to linger, letting the silence stretch like an elastic band ready to snap. The room's chatter seemed to fade as Julian studied her expression, suddenly noticing the subtle edge in her eyes. A flicker of uncertainty passed over his features, the first crack in his carefully constructed arrogance. Then came the moment that changed everything. Julian, in a show of careless bravado, raised a champagne flute to toast himself, glancing over at Isabel. "To victories large and small, and to knowing exactly what, or who, is worth our attention." He let the words hang, accompanied by a smirk that suggested he was both the observer and the judge. Isabel's pulse quickened. The words were not meant to be cruel this time, they were meant to demonstrate dominance. But she had realized that dominance is only effective when unchallenged. And she was not about to remain unchallenged. She excused herself gracefully, slipping past the gathering crowd, the velvet of her gown whispering against polished marble. The murmurs followed her, whispers of curiosity and admiration, but she ignored them. Her mind raced with possibilities, each thought a seed of careful strategy. Humiliation had been thrust upon her, yes, but humiliation, she realized, was a weapon in the hands of the clever. In a quiet corner of the gala, behind towering floral arrangements, Isabel's hand trembled, not with fear, but with adrenaline. She pulled her phone from her clutch, opening a secure app that connected her to a network of financial and legal contacts she had quietly cultivated over the past year. Every text, every call, every silent hour spent learning the intricacies of Julian's empire had prepared her for this. Tonight wasn't just about revenge, it was about precision. Julian, meanwhile, returned to the center of attention, laughter resuming around him. His eyes, however, flicked repeatedly toward Isabel. Something in her silence unnerved him, a subtle shift he couldn't yet define. In the past, she had acquiesced, smiled politely, and allowed his arrogance to dominate. Tonight, that acquiescence was gone. And Julian, for all his confidence, did not yet realize that the balance of power had begun to tilt. Isabel's gaze swept across the room one last time before she moved with purpose. Every detail mattered, the placement of the financial records she had secured, the timing of her calls, the exposure of weaknesses Julian had considered impenetrable. She was calm, precise, and deadly in her calculation. This was not impulsive revenge, it was orchestrated dismantling, executed with the patience and skill of someone who had long been underestimated. The first contact was a subtle text, sent to a trusted associate who oversaw one of Julian's overseas investments. Isabel's fingers hovered over her phone as she typed, "Initiate review immediately. Discrepancies must be highlighted by midnight. Don't delay." She sent it with deliberate calm, as if she were merely a woman managing household affairs rather than a strategist about to unravel a financial empire. Meanwhile, Julian was distracted by compliments, handshakes, and the flashing cameras. He did not notice the subtle tremor in the foundation of his empire, the first domino about to fall. Isabel watched him from across the room, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. This was the exact moment she had imagined, the calm before chaos, the point where arrogance meets its reckoning. A waiter approached, offering a refill of champagne. Isabel accepted with grace, her mind elsewhere, orchestrating moves and countermoves like a chess master. Every detail mattered: who would notice first, what would trigger cascading failures, and how the public would perceive the sudden unraveling of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Julian lifted his glass to toast again, and Isabel's eyes met his across the room. In that brief moment, unspoken words passed between them. One was arrogance cloaked in charm, the other was fury cloaked in elegance. Both were aware, in some unconscious sense, that this night would define the trajectory of their lives. And then the first ripple hit. Isabel's call to a key regulatory contact had triggered a preliminary review. Within minutes, notifications began cascading to Julian's executive team. Subtle at first, emails marked urgent, whispers among staff, but enough to raise eyebrows. Julian's smile faltered, a micro-expression almost imperceptible to the crowd but glaringly clear to Isabel. She allowed herself a private, quiet satisfaction. The spark had been lit. The humiliation he had so casually inflicted had birthed a storm, and she was at its center, calm, composed, and utterly in control. Julian, unaware of the scope of the chaos, excused himself briefly, muttering to an assistant, "Check the accounts. Something feels off." His tone betrayed the first. Meanwhile, Julian sat in his office, the morning sun reflecting off the polished mahogany desk. He scrolled through emails, frowning as he noticed a series of urgent flags from overseas accounts, regulatory notices, and unexpected financial anomalies. A prickle of unease ran down his spine, subtle but insistent. Something was off, and for the first time in years, he didn't have the immediate answer. He picked up his phone and called his assistant, trying to mask the first signs of panic. "Check the numbers again," he said, his voice clipped but tinged with tension. "Something doesn't feel right. Everything should be fine, but verify everything." Isabel, far from the chaos unfolding in Julian's office, felt the first rush of internal conflict. She wanted him to understand, truly understand, the consequences of his arrogance. Yet, part of her hesitated. Was this revenge, or was it justice? She told herself it didn't matter. The difference was subtle, but the stakes were clear. She would no longer be invisible. Julian spent the day shuttling between meetings, calls, and urgent briefings. Every time he attempted to focus on a contract or acquisition, the alerts pinged again, an anomaly here, a flagged account there. The meticulous order he had relied on for years was fracturing, and the thought that Isabel could be behind it crossed his mind fleetingly, but he dismissed it. She was elegant, refined, social, but a mastermind? No. Surely not. By mid-afternoon, Julian's confidence had begun to crack. He walked through his office, pinching the bridge of his nose, muttering under his breath. Impossible, how could this happen? Every number he reviewed seemed slightly off, as if the entire structure of his empire had been nudged just enough to wobble. Isabel, meanwhile, moved through her day with calculated calm. She met with legal consultants, financial analysts, and trusted allies, each step designed to maintain the momentum she had started. Her interactions were polite, almost mundane to the casual observer, but beneath the surface, every conversation nudged a domino closer to falling. Despite her outward composure, a part of her resisted fully embracing the chaos she was creating. She remembered the woman she had been, compliant, overlooked, graceful but restrained. That Isabel had survived through patience and politeness. And now, standing on the precipice of real power, she wrestled with the unease that came from breaking free of old patterns. Julian, unable to contain his frustration, sent an urgent message to his chief financial officer: audit everything. Triple-check all divisions. I want explanations by tonight. Something is wrong, and I want to know what. His fingers trembled slightly as he hit send. Pride and ego battled with uncertainty. The idea that Isabel could be responsible was absurd, yet the timing was too precise, the anomalies too synchronized. That evening, at home, Julian poured himself a second glass of cognac. He sat in silence, the city lights flickering against the glass walls of his apartment. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of vulnerability, not financial vulnerability, which he had always anticipated, but emotional. The realization that anyone, could undermine him so subtly, so efficiently, unsettled him. Isabel, across town, sipped her own evening tea, watching the city lights like a chessboard. She resisted allowing herself to gloat openly. Her satisfaction was private, introspective, a silent acknowledgement that she had begun to tilt the scales. Yet, as she reviewed her plan for the next moves, she felt the first twinge of doubt. What if Julian retaliated more fiercely than she anticipated? What if her actions spiraled beyond control? The resistance wasn't just external, it was internal. Both were resisting truths about themselves. Julian resisted admitting that his arrogance had blindsided him. Isabel resisted embracing the full power of her newfound agency, the thrill of control over someone who had dismissed her so completely. By nightfall, the first tangible consequences began to ripple outward. An investor called Julian's office, voice sharp and concerned, questioning sudden discrepancies in the portfolio. Another message flagged an unusual pattern in one of the subsidiaries. Julian's office buzzed with activity, but he felt powerless in a way he had never experienced. Isabel, watching the first tremors of impact unfold from a distance, allowed herself a rare smile. Yet even in triumph, she hesitated. She resisted celebrating too loudly, too quickly. Every move had to be precise, every step calculated. Pride demanded satisfaction, but strategy demanded patience. That night, both lay awake in their respective beds, Julian, restless and haunted by the first crack in his empire, Isabel, energized but contemplative, weighing the consequences of her actions. Resistance, in its various forms, had defined the day. Each had faced challenges, external and internal, that demanded reflection, restraint, and careful maneuvering. And in that shared night of tension, though neither realized it yet, the emotional collision between them had only begun. The spark from the gala had ignited a slow-burning fire, one that would not easily be extinguished. Have you ever resisted confronting someone who underestimated you? Share your story below. What did it take for you to take action? The following morning, a severe storm swept across the city, sending rain streaking down glass towers and turning streets into rivers of reflected lights. Isabel's car, sleek and black, cut through the torrents with practiced ease, yet she couldn't shake the sense of foreboding curling in her chest. The storm mirrored the inner turbulence of the previous night's events, her plan unfolding perfectly, yet fraught with the unpredictable tension of human emotion. Julian, on the other side of town, had just concluded a series of frantic calls. His empire, though vast and resilient, had experienced its first measurable tremor. Investors demanded explanations, staff questioned decisions, and regulatory agencies pressed for clarification. Julian had no choice but to leave the office, despite the storm, and attend a crucial meeting with one of his most influential investors. Fate, it seemed, had decided to accelerate their collision. Isabel's navigation system, an obedient assistant she often relied on, suggested a route that led directly past Julian's hotel headquarters, a hub of power, charm, and arrogance. She frowned, resisting the symbolism, telling herself it was purely practical. She had a meeting there, a key step in her orchestration. Yet, as the rain lashed against her windshield, she couldn't ignore the irony of proximity. Julian, arriving at the investor meeting soaked from the storm, barely noticed the luxury of the hotel lobby as he brushed past. He was consumed by his own thoughts, frustrated by the invisible opponent destabilizing his carefully constructed empire. Every detail of the storm, the thunder, the glare of rain against marble floors, mirrored the chaos rising inside him. And then, as Isabel entered the hotel lobby to meet with a legal associate, the universe conspired in perfect timing. Julian, preoccupied and unaware, emerged from the opposite side. Their eyes met across the vast space, and for a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to pause. Neither moved. Words hung unspoken in the air, tension coiling like a serpent ready to strike. Julian's smirk was absent. In its place was a flicker of recognition, a subtle acknowledgement that Isabel's influence might extend further than he had ever imagined. Isabel's posture remained calm, deliberate, yet her eyes sparkled with a quiet challenge. She had expected this encounter. She had anticipated it. And yet, the visceral thrill of proximity, the way the air seemed to thicken between them, made her pulse quicken. Neither could avoid the other. The storm had trapped them both in a series of unavoidable logistical coincidences, the hotel lobby acting as a nexus where professional necessity collided with personal tension. They moved through the space with the politeness demanded by public expectation, but the underlying friction was palpable. Every glance, every gesture carried layers of meaning. Julian attempted casual conversation, his tone light, but the underlying edge betrayed his unease. "Isabel, what a surprise. I didn't expect to see you here." His eyes flicked to her phone, the source of her recent orchestrations, and then away, almost as if measuring the potential threat she posed. Isabel allowed herself a faint, polite smile, her lips curving just enough to convey civility while withholding true emotion. "Julian," she said evenly, "I have important matters to attend to. Business, as you know, doesn't wait for weather." The statement was innocuous on the surface, yet it carried subtle implication. She was no longer merely present in his orbit, she was operating independently, strategically, and with purpose. Forced proximity amplified every nuance. The subtle tension in Julian's jaw, the deliberate calm in Isabel's movements, the way neither could ignore the other's presence. All of it created a charged atmosphere that neither wealth nor social etiquette could dilute. Guests and staff moved around them, blissfully unaware of the undercurrent, but for the two central figures, every interaction was electric. The meeting Isabel attended required collaboration with a lawyer who represented a division of Julian's company. 4 hours, they sat in the same conference room, the storm outside a relentless backdrop. Julian's presence in the building, coincidental or otherwise, ensured that paths would cross repeatedly. Elevator rides, shared hallways, moments at the water cooler, all orchestrated by circumstance yet magnified by the tension between them. During one elevator ride, Julian finally broke the silence. His voice was measured, but the words carried weight. "You've been busy." His eyes searched hers for reaction. "It seems some things are unraveling." Isabel's response was cool, almost teasing. "Unraveling can be beautiful, if handled carefully. Chaos reveals what was hidden, don't you think?" Her words were innocuous enough to seem conversational, yet sharp enough to pierce the armor of his ego. The storm outside raged on, a perfect metaphor for the storm building between them. Rain lashed against the elevator's polished glass walls, the thunder rumbling low in the distance. In that confined space, the emotional proximity was as intense as the physical closeness. Julian felt a subtle pressure, the first real indication that he was no longer fully in control. Isabel, for her part, felt the thrill of empowerment tempered by strategy. She could see the small micro-expressions of doubt flicker across Julian's face, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the tiny hesitation before speaking. She catalogued each one silently, knowing the storm of her plans was only beginning, yet enjoying this rare taste of confrontation before her eventual victory. Forced proximity did more than create tension, it revealed truths. Julian realized he had underestimated Isabel in every meaningful way. She was not simply a passive observer in his life, she was a force, precise, calculating, and unyielding. Isabel understood that while wealth and status had given Julian power, they did not protect him from strategy, intellect, or emotional resolve. Hours passed in this delicate ballet of avoidance, observation, and subtle power plays. The storm outside persisted, mirroring the turbulence within. Neither was yet ready to fully engage, yet neither could entirely retreat. Every glance, every carefully measured word, hinted at the eventual collision that would define their relationship. By evening, both were exhausted yet acutely aware of the unspoken challenge hanging between them. Forced proximity had stripped away the illusion of separation. The tension was no longer avoidable. For the first time, Julian recognized that Isabel's quiet strength was as formidable as any financial maneuver. And Isabel understood in turn that Julian's arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. If she struck with precision, she could unravel not only his empire but the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. The storm began to subside, leaving streets wet and reflective, mirroring the delicate balance of power now established between them. Both stepped into the night with a heightened awareness, their paths intertwined by circumstances neither could fully control. The stage was set, the stakes elevated, and the slow burn of revenge had moved from planning to inevitable confrontation. Have you ever been forced into a situation with someone who challenged you completely? Comment below on how you handled it. Did you fight, retreat, or plan your next move? The storm had left the city streets glistening, the reflections of streetlights quivering in puddles. Isabel walked calmly through the quiet avenues, her heels clicking softly on wet pavement. Despite the outward calm, her mind was alive with calculations, moves, countermoves, the unfolding chaos in Julian's empire. Yet beneath her meticulous strategy lingered another current, a memory long buried, a moment from her past that had quietly shaped her. Years ago, before wealth, before Julian, Isabel had been a young woman with dreams far too big for the small apartment she called home. She had worked tirelessly in a corporate office, overlooked and underestimated by managers who believed charm and beauty were her only assets. One evening, after a particularly humiliating public reprimand, she had stared at her reflection in a grimy bathroom mirror and whispered a vow she never forgot: "I will never let anyone diminish me again." That vow had become her secret engine. While others believed her polite, elegant, and compliant, she had built networks, learned strategy, and quietly honed the skills that would allow her to navigate and eventually dismantle Julian's world. The humiliation at the gala had awakened the memory, fueling the fire already kindling within her. Every action she took now was the manifestation of years of preparation, patience, and unacknowledged intelligence. Meanwhile, Julian, oblivious to Isabel's inner reflections, sat in his penthouse, reviewing reports with a growing sense of unease. His empire, polished and precise, had begun showing cracks, and for the first time, his confidence faltered. But this wasn't the first time Julian had felt exposed. Years ago, Julian had inherited a fortune built on ambition and ruthlessness, but he had also endured betrayal that left invisible scars. A trusted business partner had embezzled millions, leaving him humiliated in front of investors and peers. He had survived, rebuilt, and cultivated his empire with the singular goal of control. Love, tenderness, and vulnerability had been casualties of that pursuit. Isabel, in his eyes, was a refinement of status and beauty, expected to complement his success, not challenge it. And when she did, the realization that he could be outmaneuvered stirred something he had long ignored: fear. The two narratives converged later that evening in Julian's hotel conference room, a neutral ground dictated by circumstance. Isabel arrived for a scheduled legal consultation regarding one of Julian's subsidiary companies. She had deliberately chosen this meeting to intersect with his presence, knowing that proximity would compel interaction and observation. Julian, initially dismissive, recognized her immediately. The same tension from the elevator, the storm, the city, the glare of the fading day outside, returned, now intensified by the intimate confines of the meeting room. He attempted to maintain authority, but every gesture, every glance, betrayed the growing unease he had been trying to suppress. Isabel began reviewing financial reports with her legal associate, yet her attention was subtly divided. She observed Julian's reactions to the discussion, noting the slight furrow in his brow when certain discrepancies were mentioned, the small flicker of doubt in his eye. Every detail confirmed what she already suspected: Julian was meticulous, but not infallible. And this knowledge, combined with her long-buried skills and experience, made her an unstoppable force. During a lull in the meeting, Isabel allowed herself a brief vulnerability, a subtle hint of past pain escaping in the quiet sigh she could not fully mask. Julian noticed immediately, not the elegant composure, but the brief shadow of struggle, of endurance over years of underestimation. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He had seen it before, in boardroom betrayals and financial collapses, but never in a woman who commanded attention without raising her voice. "Isabel," Julian said carefully, breaking the silence, you've always been more capable than I realized." His words were hesitant, almost reluctant, yet they carried a weight of acknowledgement. Isabel's gaze met his, unwavering, unyielding. "Julian," she replied, voice even, "capability is not always obvious. Some of us learn patience first, precision second, and revenge, eventually." Her words were calm, almost casual, yet they carried the power of revelation. The past humiliation, the calculated response, and the depth of her intelligence were all on display. Julian's mind raced. He remembered glimpses of her in social settings, in his carefully curated circles, moments where he had dismissed her intellect in favor of charm. Every slight, every joke, every underestimation now rang with new significance. He realized that the woman he thought he knew was an orchestrator of events far beyond his initial comprehension. Isabel, sensing his dawning awareness, allowed a small controlled smile to appear, proof that the backstory, the years of underestimated preparation, was no longer hidden. Julian was beginning to see the full scope of her power, the culmination of quiet ambition, and the emotional scars that had forged her into this force. For the first time, Julian confronted his own vulnerabilities, the old betrayals and failures that had made him arrogant, defensive, and dismissive. Isabel had not only survived humiliation, she had transformed it into strength, strategy, and dominance. And the realization unsettled him more than any financial crisis ever could. The meeting concluded with both acknowledging the stakes without explicitly stating them. Julian's internal landscape had shifted. The arrogance that had once shielded him was now tempered by awareness of Isabel's capabilities. Isabel had revealed fragments of her backstory, strategic, emotional, and personal, but carefully controlled, leaving Julian unsettled, intrigued, and wary. That evening, as Isabel left the building, Julian lingered by the window, staring at the storm-reflecting streets. Her calm, measured defiance, combined with hints of past struggle and intelligence, haunted him. For Julian, the realization was both frightening and oddly magnetic. The woman he had underestimated was now the one setting the rules of engagement. Isabel walked home through the quiet, rain-soaked streets, reflecting on the delicate dance of strategy, history, and emotion. The storm had cleared, but the echoes remained, of humiliation transformed into power, of secrets unveiled, and of vulnerabilities laid bare in the presence of someone who could match intellect with intuition. Days passed since the storm, yet the tension between Isabel and Julian lingered like the aftertaste of strong wine. Isabel had continued her calculated orchestration of his empire's unraveling, but a subtle curiosity began creeping into her thoughts. Julian was more than the arrogant, dismissive man she had believed him to be. There was complexity hidden beneath the layers of pride and power, moments she glimpsed in fleeting expressions, brief hesitations, and the rare, unguarded sighs. Julian, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about her. He saw her not just as the instigator of chaos, but as someone who had endured struggles he could relate to in ways he rarely admitted. The arrogance that once made him untouchable had softened, just enough for him to notice the quiet strength that drove her. For the first time in years, he questioned his assumptions, not just about her, but about what had been missing in his own life. They met again at a corporate event, a neutral space under the guise of social obligation. Isabel arrived first, her presence poised and deliberate, yet she allowed herself a small moment of self-reflection. She realized she had grown stronger, not only in action but in understanding. Her intelligence was formidable, but her emotional insight was equally sharp. She noticed the little things, the way Julian's eyes briefly softened when a child ran past, the rare grin that crept onto his face at a clever quip from a colleague. Julian entered moments later, exuding the polished charisma everyone expected of him, but Isabel could see the cracks beneath the surface. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't untouchable. And she felt an unexpected flicker of something she hadn't anticipated, curiosity mingled with respect. The initial conversation was cautious, polite, and formal. Isabel complimented a recent philanthropic initiative he had undertaken, masking the fact that she knew the legal loopholes and financial intricacies that made it possible. Julian responded with measured charm, subtly probing for her reactions, trying to gauge whether she was simply composed or secretly calculating. Then, in a quiet moment away from the crowd, a genuine exchange occurred. Julian noticed Isabel fidgeting with the bracelet she always wore, the heirloom pearl that symbolized her inner resolve. "That's beautiful," he said softly, surprising even himself. "It suits you." Isabel glanced at him, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity. "It belonged to my grandmother," she replied, voice calm but with a hint of warmth. "She always said strength comes quietly, in small gestures." Julian paused, sensing layers beneath her words. "Strength quietly, yes. I've learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving." His admission was subtle, almost a whisper, yet it carried the weight of vulnerability. Isabel felt it, the first crack in the wall of arrogance he had maintained for years. Their conversation deepened, moving from polite acknowledgments to shared stories of endurance and quiet victories. Isabel spoke of challenges in her early career, of the persistence required to be taken seriously in a world that often dismissed her. Julian, unusually candid, shared fragments of past betrayals that had taught him to trust cautiously, to rely on control over vulnerability. In this space, emotional bonding occurred, not through grand gestures, but through recognition of shared experiences. Both realized that beneath the armor of wealth, social expectation, and ego, they carried wounds, fears, and strengths that were strikingly similar. Laughter, a rare occurrence between them, broke through unexpectedly when Julian mispronounced the name of a mutual acquaintance. Isabel smiled, genuine amusement flickering across her face. Julian's eyes softened in return, and for a fleeting moment, the weight of past conflicts lifted. The bond forming was delicate, a fragile bridge spanning humiliation, pride, and mutual respect. Later, as the event drew to a close, Julian offered to escort Isabel to her car. The rain from the previous storm had left the streets glistening, reflecting the city lights like a mirror. Silence stretched between them, comfortable yet charged, until Julian spoke, voice low, "I underestimated you, Isabel. Not just your intellect, but your resilience. I see it now." Isabel's response was equally measured, a quiet acknowledgement of the evolving dynamic. "It's easy to underestimate people, Julian. Especially when you're used to being in control. But resilience has its own way of revealing itself." The words hung between them, heavy with implication yet free from confrontation. Both recognized the subtle shift, acknowledgement of each other's capabilities, vulnerabilities, and shared humanity. They were no longer solely adversaries. A fragile connection had begun to form. Back in her penthouse, Isabel reflected on the day. She felt a strange duality, satisfaction at the progress of her plan, tempered by the unexpected awareness of Julian's complexity. He was not simply an obstacle or a target. He was a man capable of reflection, growth, and perhaps, eventual reconciliation. The realization unsettled her, yet it added depth to the unfolding narrative. Julian, in his office, poured himself a drink and allowed himself to replay the conversation. He felt something he hadn't in years: respect, tinged with admiration and curiosity. Isabel was formidable, precise, and emotionally intelligent. And though her actions threatened his empire, her presence stirred a part of him he had long ignored, a recognition that connection and vulnerability were not weaknesses, but strengths. That night, both lay awake in their respective beds, replaying moments of subtle bonding, the shared smiles, the tentative admissions, the flickers of vulnerability. The emotional landscape between them had shifted. From humiliation and resistance, they had moved into a space of recognition and tentative connection. The storm of revenge was still looming, but now interwoven with it was the possibility of understanding, empathy, and perhaps, unexpected affection. Have you ever connected with someone you initially saw as an opponent? Comment below, what made you recognize their humanity? The morning after their tentative bonding, the city hummed with activity, oblivious to the storm brewing in the hearts of its most prominent figures. Isabel arrived at her office, anticipation mingling with a subtle unease. She had carefully cultivated the connections and strategies that would dismantle Julian's empire, but her growing respect, and the delicate bond forming between them, had added an unexpected tension. She felt a thrill of empowerment tempered by an undercurrent of caution. Meanwhile, Julian was already in his executive suite, reviewing the latest reports that reflected continuing anomalies in his empire. He was beginning to suspect Isabel's involvement. But more than that, he felt a strange internal conflict. The woman he had begun to respect, and perhaps even feel something for, was now clearly his most formidable adversary. Pride and attraction tangled uncomfortably, making every decision heavier. The catalyst arrived unexpectedly. One of Julian's key financial partners, unaware of Isabel's careful orchestration, contacted him directly. Their tone was alarmed. "Sir, there are reports of unauthorized actions in the European holdings. It appears that certain agreements have been altered. The board is asking for explanations immediately." Julian's pulse quickened. The pieces were aligning too conveniently, but he couldn't yet connect them explicitly to Isabel. Suspicion gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. Anger began to replace hesitation, fueling his need to assert control. Isabel, at the same moment, received word that one of Julian's subsidiaries had begun to unravel publicly. Though she had anticipated the timing, she had not expected the swift escalation that now unfolded. The news should have exhilarated her plan was working, but instead, she felt a pang of dread. The unintended consequences of her actions had begun to spill into territory she hadn't fully controlled. By noon, the confrontation was inevitable. Isabel had scheduled a private meeting with Julian under the guise of discussing minor legal matters. The conference room, quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning, became the stage for the clash. Julian entered, expression taut, eyes sharp. Isabel noticed immediately. His pride was wounded, and it was directing his words before thought could intervene. "You've gone too far," Julian said, voice low and edged with anger. "This isn't business, it's personal. I trusted you and he faltered, frustration overtaking him. "You've sabotaged everything." Isabel's pulse raced, not with fear, but with the awareness that this was the emotional nadir. The trust they had begun to build was now at risk, teetering on the edge. "Julian," she said evenly, "I have taken steps to ensure that mismanagement, arrogance, and oversight are addressed. Nothing more." Julian's lips pressed into a thin line. "Nothing more." His voice cracked slightly. "Isabel, I can't believe you would do this to me, to everything I've built." He paced the room, each step punctuating the gravity of his feelings: anger, hurt, disbelief. The conversation escalated. Isabel attempted to clarify her actions, to explain that her measures were calculated, strategic, and not intended as personal malice. Julian, however, was blinded by pride and the sting of betrayal. Every word from her sounded like justification, every calm gesture a dismissal of his suffering. Emotions boiled over. Julian's hands shook slightly as he slammed a report onto the conference table. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've jeopardized lives, investments. You've humiliated me in ways you may not even realize. Isabel's composure faltered, just enough to reveal the depth of her own emotional investment. I underestimated the human element, she admitted softly. I thought control and precision would be enough. But yes, the consequences are real, and I will take responsibility where needed. The exchange left them both breathless, emotionally raw, and painfully aware of the chasm that had opened between them. The bond that had begun to form, shared vulnerability, respect, and tentative connection, was shattered in moments of anger, misunderstanding, and pride. Julian turned away abruptly, pacing toward the window. Rain had returned to the city streets, as if echoing the turmoil within him. I can't even look at you right now, he muttered. His words carried both fear and wounded pride, the mixture of emotions too complex to fully articulate. Isabel, standing alone, felt a strange emptiness. The thrill of strategic victory had vanished, replaced by the weight of emotional loss. She realized that dismantling his empire had consequences she hadn't fully anticipated, consequences that reached beyond financial victory into the realm of hearts and trust. The meeting ended with no resolution, both retreating to their separate spaces, the emotional distance now wider than it had ever been. Julian returned to his office, reviewing reports with a mechanical precision, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying their interactions and the subtle moments of connection that had now been tainted by misunderstanding. Isabel, back in her penthouse, allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She had achieved measurable success, the chaos had begun, but the cost was clear. The personal bond they had begun to cultivate, fragile and precious, had been fractured. Pride, misunderstanding, and the relentless pursuit of justice had collided in a way that left both parties wounded. The evening descended quietly, the city lights casting long reflections on rain-soaked streets. Both Isabel and Julian lay awake, separately, haunted not by the success or failure of financial maneuvers, but by the emotional fallout of their confrontation. Trust, once tested, had been broken, connection, once budding, now threatened by pride and misunderstanding. Yet even in this lowest point, a seed of reflection remained. Both were forced to confront their own vulnerabilities, Julian's arrogance and blind reliance on control, Isabel's underestimation of the emotional consequences of strategy. The shatterpoint had been reached, the lowest emotional moment, but it also set the stage for choice, reckoning, and the possibility of transformation. Have you ever had a fragile connection break due to misunderstanding? Share below how you handled it and if reconciliation was possible. The city was quiet in the early morning, fog curling around streetlights and buildings, muting the world in a soft gray hush. Isabel sat in her penthouse, the glow of the skyline reflecting across her polished floors. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to pause, to step away from strategy, revenge, and careful calculation. The confrontation in the conference room had left scars deeper than she had anticipated. Pride had collided with emotion, leaving her unsure of the path forward. Her mind replayed Julian's words, his voice tight with anger, hurt, and incredulity. She knew she had overstepped, even if her actions had been justified. But beyond pride and strategy, something unexpected had taken root, a recognition of his complexity, a respect for his intelligence, and a quiet acknowledgement that she had felt, against every expectation, an emotional bond. 4 hours, Isabel considered her options. She could continue her campaign, allowing the chaos she had initiated to unfold fully, preserving the intellectual victory but at the cost of any personal connection. Or she could reach out, risk vulnerability, and attempt to bridge the gap that pride had fractured. The choice was neither simple nor safe. Julian, meanwhile, paced his office, the city lights flickering against the windows. The night's reflection of rain-streaked streets mirrored the turmoil within him. His empire was stabilizing, but his heart was unsettled. Pride warred with curiosity, anger collided with admiration, and his usual control was useless in navigating these emotions. He knew Isabel was out there, somewhere in the city, and with each passing moment, he felt a growing urgency. Their connection, so fragile, so improbable, was worth the risk of reconciliation. But fear of rejection, of further humiliation, made him hesitate. Julian had spent years guarding his vulnerability, and now that the walls were breached, he had to decide whether to retreat or embrace uncertainty. Late afternoon arrived, bringing with it the subtle hum of city life. Isabel, still reflective, checked her phone one final time. A message typed, erased, and typed again. Meet me at the gallery on 5th. We need to talk. No strategy, no business, just honesty. Julian received it moments later, reading the words carefully. Honesty. No strategy. Just truth. His chest tightened, and he recognized the gravity of the moment. This was a choice point. Pride could dictate silence, maintaining distance and ego. Or vulnerability could lead him to her, risking emotional exposure in exchange for potential reconciliation. He arrived at the gallery first, the minimalist space bathed in warm, natural light, paintings and sculptures reflecting human emotion and fragility. He stood near the entrance, hands loosely clasped, nerves taut in a way he rarely admitted. The seconds stretched. Isabel entered, graceful yet purposeful, carrying a quiet intensity. The space between them was charged, yet neither spoke immediately. Both were acutely aware that words would matter, that every syllable, gesture, and glance carried the weight of days of strategy, humiliation, and tentative bonding. Julian spoke first, voice low and steady. Isabel, I can't pretend I understand everything you've done, or why you did it. But I know one thing, I underestimated you. And I don't want to underestimate you again. Not in business, not in anything else. Isabel's breath caught. The honesty in his voice, the raw acknowledgement of his error and pride, softened the tension between them. Julian, she replied, her voice equally calm, I allowed strategy to take precedence over understanding. I let the pursuit of justice, of empowerment, overshadow the connection we had begun to build. That was my mistake. They paused, letting the gravity of mutual acknowledgement settle in. Silence was no longer awkward, it was intimate. Both recognized that the emotional chasm of the previous acts had not closed entirely, but the possibility existed, if they chose it. Julian took a tentative step closer. Can we start over? Not from zero, but from a place of honesty, of mutual respect? I don't want pride to keep us apart. Isabel's eyes softened, reflecting years of experience, struggle, and resilience. I want that too, she admitted. But we need boundaries, clarity, and trust. Without that, anything we build could crumble. The choice was made not with a grand gesture, but with quiet affirmation. Both were willing to risk vulnerability, to acknowledge mistakes, and to meet in the middle. Pride would no longer dictate the terms of engagement. Honesty, respect, and shared understanding would guide their next steps. Julian reached out, fingers brushing lightly against hers. Not a kiss, not a claim, but a gesture of tentative trust. Isabel met the touch, allowing herself a moment to feel the connection, the possibility, the fragile hope that had survived humiliation, resistance, forced proximity, backstory revelations, and the shatterpoint. They stood together in silence, the gallery around them muted yet resonant, each aware that this choice was the turning point. From this moment forward, their actions would be guided not by ego or revenge, but by intentional, conscious partnership. Even as they prepared to leave the gallery, the city outside reflected the transformation within them. Sunlight broke through clouds, glinting on glass towers and wet streets. Symbolically, the storm that had defined the past days had cleared, leaving a sense of possibility, renewal, and cautious hope. This act of choice was more than reconciliation, it was empowerment. Both Isabel and Julian had confronted their flaws, vulnerabilities, and emotional truths. Both had decided to move forward, not without risk, but with clarity. The emotional trajectory had shifted from tension and conflict to mutual understanding. A bridge had been formed, delicate but real. Have you ever taken a risk to repair a broken relationship? Comment below, what guided your decision? The morning sun spilled across the city, painting streets in warm hues, a stark contrast to the stormy days that had defined the past week. Isabel stood at the terrace of her penthouse, overlooking the skyline she had come to know so intimately, not just as a backdrop to her ambitions, but as a stage for her transformation. The chaos she had orchestrated in Julian's empire had subsided, leaving lessons learned, boundaries tested, and power recalibrated. Julian arrived unexpectedly, not with an air of confrontation, but with quiet intention. He carried neither ego nor bitterness, only acknowledgement and respect for what had transpired. Their previous choice, the emotional bridge built in the gallery, had not been fragile, it had strengthened under the weight of honesty, reflection, and courage. "Good morning," he said softly, offering a hand not for business, but for partnership. Isabel smiled, a mixture of pride, relief, and anticipation crossing her features. "Morning," she replied, stepping closer. "I see the city differently today. It feels quieter, more grounded. Or maybe it's just me." Julian chuckled lightly, a rare, unguarded sound. "I feel the same. All the chaos, all the turmoil, it's given me perspective. And I realize that some things, important things, are worth more than control or pride." They stood side by side, the city stretching infinitely before them. The reflection of glass towers and sunlit streets mirrored the transformation within each of them. Isabel's strength, intelligence, and resilience had been tested and proven. Julian's pride, arrogance, and need for control had been challenged, softened, and recalibrated. Both had faced shatterpoints, moments of despair, and the consequences of strategic actions. Yet they had emerged not only intact but transformed, ready to navigate the next chapter together. In the days that followed, Julian's empire stabilized. Isabel's interventions, initially perceived as threats, were reframed as strategic counsel, her keen insight and foresight now recognized and respected. The public narrative shifted subtly, investors and partners were reassured, and Julian's reputation, while temporarily tested, emerged stronger because of the transparency and reckoning he had undergone. More importantly, their personal dynamic flourished. They discovered a rhythm of partnership that balanced vulnerability and ambition, respect and affection. Meetings and business dealings became arenas for collaboration rather than conflict. Social events transformed into shared experiences rather than battlegrounds. One evening, as the city's lights flickered on and the streets shimmered with reflections of passing cars, Isabel and Julian walked along a quiet avenue, the hum of urban life surrounding them. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from a nearby park. The night was calm, almost serene, a contrast to the storms they had weathered, both literal and emotional. Julian stopped and looked at Isabel, his expression tender yet resolute. "I underestimated you, not just as a strategist, but as a person. I've spent years believing control was everything, and I realize now, connection matters more." Isabel reached out, lightly brushing her fingers against his. "And I've learned that strength is not just about power or precision. It's also about trust, compromise, and understanding." Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a blend of admiration, affection, and unspoken promise. No words were needed to seal the reconciliation. The emotional journey of 9 acts had built a foundation solid enough to support love, respect, and partnership. Later, in the privacy of a quiet evening at her penthouse, they celebrated their triumph, not over each other, but over the limitations imposed by pride, ego, and misunderstanding. Isabel poured 2 glasses of wine, raising one in a subtle toast. "To clarity," she said softly. Julian mirrored her gesture, smiling. "To honesty, and the courage to choose it." They clinked glasses, a sound more profound than celebration, a sound of victory over internal conflict, emotional obstacles, and societal expectations. They had achieved what many never do: connection forged through respect, understanding, and vulnerability. Even as the city slept, they lingered on the terrace, the skyline before them a symbol of opportunity, renewal, and the possibilities that awaited. The empire, the power, the chaos, all of it was secondary to the bond they had solidified. They had faced humiliation, resistance, forced proximity, and shattering moments, yet emerged not only victorious but whole. The day ended with a quiet embrace, a gentle acknowledgement that the past had been reconciled, the present understood, and the future open. Isabel and Julian had not only rebuilt bridges, they had constructed a foundation strong enough to weather any storm, literal or emotional, that life might bring. The narrative of humiliation turned into triumph, betrayal into understanding, and chaos into love at last. Their story, full of tension, strategy, and emotion, had reached a satisfying resolution, echoing the pivotal moments, the moment of humiliation and confrontation, now mirrored in a gesture of reconciliation, trust, and affection. Have you ever experienced reconciliation after conflict? Share your story below. How did honesty and vulnerability shape the outcome? Isabel and Julian, once adversaries bound by humiliation and pride, had found connection, understanding, and love at last. Their empire, strategies, and emotional journeys were intact, stronger for the lessons learned. The storm had passed. What remained was clarity, partnership, and the promise of a shared future.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. I am pretty sure you enjoyed it. We have a lot of other interesting and beautiful stories lined up for you. So subscribe to the channel to get more amazing videos.